So the outline of my presentation is going to be that first I'll talk about the Nyaya history and theism. Then I'll talk briefly on Udhyana, on Ishvara, his eight proofs for the existence of God, and then going to the West, where in medieval Christianity I'll talk about the theism of Aquinas, and then his five ways, and then I'll basically bring up four skeptical arguments, and I'll see how each one of them stands against these skeptical arguments and how they try to answer them or acknowledge them. So this is just a brief history of the Vedant, Yoga, and Visheshika and Nyaya literature. Sorry, it's just too small for everyone, but probably want to share it in paper with all of you. But the red ones are the Vedantins. The pink ones are the Buddhists, and then we have the uh, yoga philosophers. The green ones are from Visheshika, and then we've got the Nyaya philosophers. Particularly, we'll be looking at Udayana, who is in the end, which is the 10th century, and Gautama is in the first century. So, just to give a brief context of who we'll be talking about, um, basically, we find that Nyaya school was a school focused on logic, but we find some theistic proofs in the earlier philosophers as well, which is in Gautama's Nyaya Sutra, in Nyaya Bhashya of Vatsyayana, in Prashastapad, and Udyottakara also. But what Udyana has done is he has collated all the works, all the theistic proofs of these philosophers and compiled it in one text, which is the Nyaya Kusumanjali. So the word actually means a handful of flowers, and he has two works, theistic texts. First is Nyaya Kusumanjali, the other is Atma Tattva Vivek. And his biggest contribution has been to bring all of the texts which have the proofs in one particular text, which is the Nyaya And the first, so it's divided in five chapters, the Nyaya of which the first four chapters are arguments against the Buddhist schools, the Mimamsa schools, the Jainas, and the Charvaks. And we also find that it is a pro-Vedic thought uh, treatise in the Nyaya Okay, so talking about Udayacharya's theism, we find that in the Atma Tattva Vivek, he has five particular traits or attributes that he gives to Ishvara. First is permanent, sthira, eternal, nitya, omnipresent, vibhu, and it is distinct from the body. And he also mentions Ishvara as ocean of joy, which is Anandaniti. He also claims that the author of the Vedas is Ishvara. Again, one interesting concept or thought that came to me was Udyanacharya was considered to be the champion of Nyaya's theism in the 10th century. But the greatest opponents, who were the Buddhists at the time, went reachingly extinct by the 11th century. So we did not have a lot of text in retaliation for what Udyanacharya had to provide. And he was the last of the earlier Nyaya philosophers, after which came Gangesha, who started the Navya Nyaya tradition. So, just a brief background on the first four chapters of Udyanacharya's Nyaya Kusumanjali, which is he gives this is again not substantive. I've just taken parts of it. He argues against Mimamsa, with the Mimamsa state that the Vedas are apurusha, which basically means that there is no author of the Vedas. But they claim, Udyanacharya claims that there is Ishvara, who is the author of the Vedas. The Buddhists claim for no self, and he claims for a self. And even in the Atma Tattva Vivek, he brings up this treatise and this argument for there being a self. The Charvak hold that that Anuman is not a Praman, while Udyanacharya, especially because it's a logical school, they uphold inference and Shabd as important Pramanas. Then for the Samkhya school, again, the Samkhya uphold that the Vedas are Purusha and the duality of Purusha and Prakriti. But Udyanacharya does not agree with this. He states that Ishvara is the author of the Vedas, and the dichotomy of Purusha and Prakriti make moksha impossible. So coming to the fifth chapter, which is the important, which I'll be focusing on. And in the fifth chapter, he gives the eight proofs for the existence of Ishvara. So in the very first shlok, he mentions all the eight proofs for the existence of God, which is Karya, Yojana, Dhrityade, Padarth, pratyatah shrute vakyat sankhya vishesh chach sadhyo vishwa vidyahe, which includes effort, combination, support, traditional arts, authoritativeness, shruti, the sentence thereof, and therefore in particular number, an everlasting omniscient being is to be established. So the first proof again is karya, which is effect. So basically, he's trying to say that the world is made is a composition of things, and therefore, it being the nature of an effect necessarily has to have the cause. And uh, just like a pot, he gives this example of a pot, and that is being made of clay. He says that there has to be a karta, which is can be related to an efficient cause, and he has the characteristics of having direct knowledge, the will, and the effort. So that these three things are required by the karta in order to change these unconscious atoms, which we go ahead to turn it into something which is of an effect. And just like a jar, the world or the universe is also an effect. Again, the word I've used it, the philosopher's name I've used it, Vachaspati, is actually uh, from where Udyanacharya has taken this particular true existence of God. The second is Ayojan, which means combination. Combination here means that the action through which the atoms combine to form the visible universe. He states that the atoms in themselves are unconscious and are not intelligent enough to form or combine to form something visible by themselves. Therefore, it requires something to combine them. And that combination is possible only to someone who he states as Ishvara. Again, this is again taken from Udyodakara and Prashastakara. So here we'll see ahead. He states in his Nyaya Manjali, he says that there is dissolution, that Ishvara is responsible for pralay, which is the destruction of all that there is, and it turns into these unconscious atoms, which is again taken from Visheshika ontology. And these unconscious atoms are again turned into something visible, which becomes part of the visible universe. And this combining movement of unconscious atoms is caused by Ishvara. So third proof is that he states from support and destruction, or like earlier mentioned, from Dhriti and Saharana. A being that possesses volition hinders the world from falling. He and else things would fall on the ground like a fruit. He again makes use of this example of a fruit falling, which I found very interesting. How later I think 400 or 500 years from now, Newton found a similar analogy for gravity. But he says that everything will fall and must fall, and so will the earth. And there is something which holds this and hinders it from falling. And that particular being is basically is an inference to show that Ishvara exists. So one interesting thing is that he understands the word Dhrityadi in two different ways. First, he mentions it as support, and then he also says it as preserving the tradition, which we'll see ahead how it translates in another group. So the fourth is Pad, which is again taken from yoga, which means the traditional arts. One very interesting thing here again is elements of mankind need to be taught. Elements of mankind need to be taught to mankind after intervals when there is a complete absence of patterns. For this reason, God assumes the body at intervals. I found a correlation between this and even Christian theology, even skills like cloth making and modes of writing. So these patterns and these skills, when there is absolute destructions at the time of Pralay, even the patterns seem to like stop to exist. And these patterns need to be retaught, and that is done through Ishvara. But also stands for symbols or word, or that by which something is known. Again, we see even in the Bible, we see that symbols or word is used as an analogy for God. And even here he says that even the skills such as cloth making is very interesting. Finally, the fifth, or not the final one, but the fifth proof is the fifth, sixth, and the seventh proof is from the scripture itself. So the fifth proof, he states that the scripture imparts valid knowledge and must therefore have a cause, and the cause itself must possess this ability to provide this extraordinary knowledge. Therefore, this extraordinary knowledge is not possible by an ordinary being, but an extraordinary being, and that extraordinary being is Ishvara. The sixth one is Shruti, which is a revelation, and the Vedas must be the production of an all-knowing being because it has the character of revelation. So we'll see that this is sort of circular, but this is the sixth proof which Adinacharya gives. The statements are not ordinary but require a person with unlimited knowledge and power to speak them. Seventh one, Vakyartha. Vedas are statements, therefore they need to have been spoken. So the very nature that these scriptures are statements show that these statements were spoken at some point of time. And someone who had the knowledge, as seen in the previous proof, was supposed to provide these statements. That particular being, according to Dinacharya, is Ishvara. And this again was an argument against the Mimamsa view that the Veda is apurusha, which means that it's authorless, but he says that there is an author. So I've sort of combined all these in one particular slide where they aren't ordinary statements like an ordinary person would say, but it's an extraordinary statement with knowledge. And it's an extraordinary knowledge. So only Ishvara can compose such extraordinary knowledge. And that sort of summarizes all the three from the scriptures. Finally, a Sankhya. This is Sankhya here stands for numbers and not the school Sankhya. This is a little complicated again. It's taken from Prashastapad. Binary compounds are produced by number and are derived. All numbers beyond unity are produced by the mind. So, and by the nature of apeksha buddhi, does an individual say that x is 1 and y is 1? The concept of duality requires an intellect to discriminate. So at the moment of destruction, basically, the next slide is visible. At the moment of destruction, so everything comes back to the diet, says, and this idea of something is dual or a triple. The very idea of something of numbers existing, this idea to differentiate between 1 and 2 or 2 and 3. So this idea of numbers itself shows that there was some knowledge or something which pre-existed all of this and has been eternal, and that particular being which produces this or is capable of apeksha buddhi is Ishvara. Moving to Thomas Aquinas, again, sort of put it in context where we have Aquinas is in purple. He's right after Anselm, just before Descartes, and this happened. And his treatise, like the Summa Theologica, came out during the 4th and the 8th Crusade, and it like superseded the first three crusades. So just to put it in context, we find that Thomas Aquinas is taking a lot from Aristotle, and it's a synthesis of Aristotle and the Christian doctrine. So I wanted to know why did he write the book, and I found out that Pope Gregory X, there was supposedly a schism between the Latin Church and the Greek Church, and what Thomas Aquinas wanted to do was to bring them together in the Dominican order. It was a particular order it wasn't Italy back then, but the Kingdom of Sicily. And in order to bring them together, he synthesized Aristotelian physics and metaphysics with the Christian theology, and that's how he came up with the Summa Theologica. Also, the book Summa Theologica was used at the time to teach students theology in the Dominican orders. Again, briefly taking from Summa Theologica, he's mentioned all of these attributes for the nature of God, which is ineffability, simplicity, perfection, goodness, infinite, immensity, immutability, eternity, and unity. So just going briefly over the nature of God and focusing on the proofs that he's given for the existence of God. So the first is all things, which is the prime mover argument or the argument from motion, which is a classic argument for the existence of God, and it's taken again from Aristotle. So all things are either actually or potentially in motion, but nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. Nothing can be at once both actuality and potentiality in the same respect, for motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. So this motion is actually moving from potential to actual. And this movement is requires someone to be absolutely or purely actual. So therefore, nothing can be both mover and moved. It must be put into motion by something else. If there were no first mover moved by no other, there would be no motion. But we know that there is motion, therefore there is a first mover, which is God according to. I've taken this example of there being a log of wood, which is at the time actually cold and potentially hot. But it requires something which is actually and purely hot, which is fire, to turn it into something which is actually hot. So similarly, using this analogy, we see that even in a person or anything at all, this I've taken a example of movement literally here, but what it means is going from something in a potential state to an actual state. Anything to which is a potential mover until it becomes an actual mover, it requires something which is purely actual, and that pure actuality is God. The second proof is the first agent argument or argument from efficient causality. Nothing is the efficient cause of itself, for cause needs to precede the effect. If P is the cause of Q, then if P is absent, so is Q. Efficient causes are ordered from first cause through intermediate causes to ultimate effect. By 2 and 3, if there is no first cause, there cannot be an ultimate effect, but there are effects. Therefore, there must be a first cause for all of them, which is God. So here also it's interesting the kinds of causes he mentions. So he says that there is an ultimate cause and there might be intermediate causes in between. And this leads to having a first cause. But he differentiates between the types of causes. So the first example he gives is of a ball hung by a chain. So in the case of the ball hung by a chain, each chain is linked to the chain above it. Each link is sort of linked to the link above it until it touches the ceiling. So ultimately it depends on the ceiling. So he sort of uses this metaphor or analogy for God. But in the other case, we find a great grandfather, a grandfather, a father and a son. The father is not dependent on the grandfather to produce a child. So these are different causes. Where in the case of the chain, each link is dependent on the link above it. But here it is not so. As in, it is independently capable of producing a child ahead. So the third proof is the argument from contingency, where we find in nature that things are possible to be and not to be. Everything is either necessary or contingent. Assume that everything is contingent. It is impossible for contingent beings to always exist. For that which cannot at some time, which cannot be at some time is not. Therefore, by 3 and 4, at one time, there was nothing. That which does not exist begins to exist only through something already existing. This again is a repetition of the first argument, and it resembles something what Aristotle said for the actuality and potentiality argument. But there is something now. Therefore, 3 is false, which is assume that everything is contingent. That means there is something which is eternal or necessary. Therefore, by 2, there is a necessary being, which is God. So the example I'm stating here is that either the world is or is not. So that is still possible, which means that it is contingent. But given that there is a world, it necessitates that there is something which was always there because actuality precedes potentiality. And in this case, it is necessary for there to be a necessary being for anything contingent to even exist. The fourth proof he gives is there is, which is an argument from gradation from beings, that there is a gradation to be found in things. Some are better, hotter or colder, etc., than others. Things are X in proportion to how closely they resemble that which is most X. Therefore, if there is nothing which is most X, there can be nothing which is good. It follows that if anything is good, there must be something that is most good. This again can be very close to what Plato's theory of forms is getting at. There must also be something which is to all beings the cause of their being, goodness, and every other perfection. And this we call God. Just like we talk about heat, so a cup of coffee and a hot air balloon or a spring, they're all hot. And there has to be something absolutely hot which imparts this hotness to these things. For everything else which is just is, there has to be something which imparts isness or beingness to it, and that thing is what he calls God. The fifth one is the argument from final causality or the teleological argument. We observe that natural bodies act towards ends. Therefore, that act toward an end either acts out of cognition or under the direction of something with knowledge, as the arrows directed by the archer. But many natural things, natural beings lack cognition. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. So in nature, he gives this example of mountains and seas, and that they are flowing in a particular direction or growing in a particular direction. For example, trees and fruits, but they are unconscious. But something has to, direct them into moving in a certain direction. So that particular thing which moves this in a particular direction is God. And he gives this example of the archer. The quote I've taken is, therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. Coming to the four skeptical arguments, the first is the argument from fallacy of composition. So this is again taken by Russell. Though effects within the universe have causes, does the entire universe also require a cause? That is like saying all men have a mother, just like all jars are made by someone. Does it also mean that all of mankind has a mother? So there's a fallacy here where we think that the sum of the parts is the whole, but that isn't the case. So Aquinas here, he says that the efficient causes are ordered from first cause through intermediate causes, like the example I gave. Just because the universe is made of contingent things does not necessitate that the collection of contingent things have a necessary first cause. So basically, Aquinas fails to answer the argument from fallacy of composition. However, in the case of Udayana, we find that things which have parts have a cause, things which do not have parts do not have a cause, and therefore are eternal. So a jar can be broken down into further things, just like mankind can be broken down into certain things. But something which is eternal or something which is the whole, for example, mankind, that falls in a separate category itself. So Udayanacharya here takes this into consideration and foresees such a possible argument. And he makes sure that he answers this particular argument by saying that we have a whichever thing is an effect can be broken down and it has basically parts to it. That is a separate thing and that has a cause. But that which does not have a part to it, for example, Ishvara or those unconscious atoms taken from Visheshika biology, they do not have a cause in themselves. So that's a separate class itself, a separate category. The second argument is taken from the argument of regress in cause and effect. So what Vina says here, if it did, there would be no first mover and consequently no other mover at all. Since second movers do not move except when moved by first mover, just as a stick does not move anything except when moved by a hand, so we must reach a first mover which is not moved by anything. And this all men think of as God. So here he's taken a nominal definition of God, but again, he has overlooked the idea of infinite regress. However, what is interesting is in Udyanacharya's work, we find that he acknowledges that a problem of infinite regress is possible by his opponents. And he gives four different ways, but the most important is eternity, which he mentions that he says that it is completely okay for there to be an infinite regress. It does not hamper his argument for the existence of God. He says that a seed and a shoot always are in a continuous infinite cycle, which means that eternities or something which is infinite exists. This infinite cycle, for example, it exists. So he says that since we know that something infinite exists, there has to be something other within the category of infinites, and that is Ishvara. So he says that there is nothing wrong with showing that there is an infinite regress. Infinite regress is not a fallacy, but needs to be accepted as long as it makes sense to a logical position. The third is the argument from problem of evil, which are taken from David Hume. So, is he willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able but not willing, then is he malevolent? Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil? So this is the classic logical argument for the problem of evil. And Aquinas states that this. So I had, even though Aquinas mentions and acknowledges the problem of there being the problem of evil in the Summa Theologica, just preceding this text, this portion on the existence of God, says this is a part of the infinite goodness of God that he should allow evil to exist, but out of it produce good. Infinity of essence and infinity of extension. God, so here he differentiates between the nature or the essence or the infinity of God. What kind of an infinity is God? So he says that there are two kinds of infinities. One is infinity of extension. That is to say, if everything is yellow, then blue cannot exist because everything that there is yellow. But he says that God is not infinite in exist in extension, but rather God is infinite in essence. So that is to say that if God is good, uh, like God is infinitely good, then God cannot, then there is a possibility for there to be a God, a possibility of evil within it, within all of extension. But he later on goes on to say that the essence of God and the existence of God are the same thing. So that is why it creates a problem. And if the existence and essence of God are the same, then it creates a problem for the argument problem of evil. Even though there's the more, all right, I'm almost done. So even though there's the moral evil argument, there's the moral evil argument and the natural evil argument. So I haven't gone into that, but these are two separate things. In the case of Adinacharya, there is no direct confrontation with the problem of evil because in the case of Adinacharya, he accepts that whatever is good and evil is in itself unreal and within the realm of Maya. So, and he agrees with the idea of karma. It is so embedded in the ontology of the metaphysics of how they function of the Nyaya philosophers that it does not occur to him that the problem, that evil is a problem to the existence of God. Since it is a direct, there is a direct connection between karma and that which is good or bad for a particular person, and whatever that is good or bad is in itself unreal. So the argument does not sustain here. And finally, coming to the argument from circularity of scripture, even though both of them take quotations, like Aquinas takes quotations from the Bible, and Udyanacharya has 5, 6, and 7. So he has 3 proofs which are rooted directly from the Vedas. We find that both of them do argue or take citations or references from the texts themselves or the scriptures. But Aquinas makes a point that he is rational, even though the Nyaya school is known for its rationality and logical enterprise. However, we find that Aquinas deliberately does not allow any direct citation or reference from the Bible to prove the existence of God, while that is not the case in Udyanacharya. Yes, that, and coming to the last part, which is the limitations which I found, which I've only taken 4 skeptical arguments, which could have been more, and I find that both are proving a different conception of God. While there's a created monotheistic God, which Saint Aquinas is trying to prove, whose existence he's trying to prove. But in the case of Udyanacharya, we find that he mentions. So we find that in Chimparati, I found that he's looked at both as a monotheist and a henotheist, or as some of you have mentioned, it could be, a cosmo-panpsychist, pantheist. So I think it's complicated. It's possible that they're just walking past each other and they're not even talking about the same particular point. But that's, I think, a huge limitation when we talk about comparing the particular proof of God which each one of them are giving. Also, they both have massive literature on hand at their hand. So I've taken a few parts of their work. What's interesting again is Aquinas in his Summa Theologica. It's a 4,000-page text, but he's only given 1.5 page to prove the existence of God, and all of them are given within that 1.5 page. Also for Udyanacharya, it's just one shlok, and then he goes on delivering one chapter out of all of his other treatises where he mentions the existence of God. So finally concluding is That there is a compilation of arguments by both of them. We find that he has used Aristotle's arguments, and while Udinacharya has used arguments from his predecessors. We also notice that Udinacharya makes use of numeric and philological proofs, which is not available or not seen in Aquinas. Udinacharya wrote to refute the claims of contemporary schools, while Aquinas wrote to provide an outline for theological studies in the Dominican order. And Udinacharya acknowledges more claims against God than Aquinas, even though his work is more of a question and answer. Udinacharya takes in consideration a lot more arguments against the existence of God. So I found that Udinacharya, with the limited proofs I've looked at, Udinacharya is more grounded than Aquinas in his exposition on God. Thank you.